Welcome to the Serious Leisure podcast. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm the host of this podcast. This is the final of 3 episodes we recorded with Professor Robert Stebbins. In this episode, we talk about optimal leisure lifestyles, how leisure is determined by what is accessible and available to us, and also about how to find a new leisure pursuit. I'm, of course, joined by Sam Elkington and Kat Branch in our conversation with Bob. Enjoy.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, you've given us an insight there into your own leisure pursuits, and I know as well just how keen, or at least until recently, very keen you are for the nature pursuits as well, outdoors and walking, mountain scrambling. I can personally vouch for this, having had Bob drag me up a couple of mountains on a stay with him in Calgary. Yeah. Which was very it was enjoyable, although you showed me up superior ability.
Sure about that, but
well, no, scrambling up mountains. I wonder, it's kind of implicit in what we're talking about here, but the idea of lifestyle choices that we make. Yeah, obviously you've been talking about the macro here in terms of the broader societal. We don't want to get too hung up in that. We haven't got the time in terms of is it real choice, and all those debates. But the lifestyle choices that we make and the role that the social world plays within that. I wondered whether you could just say a few words around that, because it's implicit in what we're talking about here. In the space of the social world, so to speak. But in terms of those lifestyle choices, because I know it's a recurrent theme in many of your books.
Yeah, and some of that's related to geography, as well as the culture of leisure in a community. Obviously, we do a lot of skiing around here, given there's no shortage of snow usually. But when I was in Newfoundland, there was plenty of snow, but I wasn't into skiing because the Newfies weren't into skiing nor snowshoeing. And so in the winter, I didn't do much of anything. And in the summer, we did some walking, but mostly I would fish trout. There's millions of those trout around in Newfoundland. So you could go out on any day. If they were biting at all, you'd come back with a basket full of them. And they made great eating, of course. So that became, I never had such good fishing. When I came to Calgary, there are trout all over the place here, but they're bigger fish, and they're in more specialized areas. And you could come back from a fishing trip fully skunked, as we'd say, with no damn fish. This is crazy. I need the exercise. That's when we got into hiking. And there was plenty to hike about, and there was lots of guidebooks, good guidebooks, about how to manage a certain trail. So it's the opportunities that are available. My son, when we came, didn't do hockey right away. He had spent, his recent 3 years in Texas. Now it wasn't on for Texans to do hockey. So he played basketball in the winter. And then he graduated and started, mixing it up with friends, learned hockey. Now that's all he plays as an adult. So you do what is available, what you have a competence for, and maybe the money. If you like deep sea fishing, well, you got to get the money to get to the deep sea, and then somebody's got to drive the boat. So that immediately changes things. So, you and I talked about space, Sam, and that's been fed into the serious leisure perspective, but there's a lot more to do. The geographers are catching on. They're interested, and I almost had a guest speaking gig, as it were, with the British geographers, but they couldn't quite get the money together. Then by the time they did, then I couldn't fly. So, but they wanted to link the SLP to geographic space. And geography's always been fairly close to leisure, but they didn't have this broad perspective until more recently. Okay, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's almost like you're reading my mind. I was going to bring this idea of space in because, again, that's somewhat of a recurrent theme across the podcast, and again, as you've highlighted there, Bob, it's relatively under-examined as an integral part of the serious leisure perspective. Although we have tried in the past, we have tried. Yeah, we have done our part. People need to do theirs. But the significance of space, the affordances of space in terms of the opportunities they provide for certain activities, and how the environment actually draws people in, and actually are the part of the motivation for even moving to certain locations. Yeah. So I know plenty of people in academia, particularly, and we've heard people speak on the podcast who have taken jobs, who have moved to. I've moved to the north of the country here in England, to be closer, and we've done it on purpose. It's to be close to family. Yeah, the opportunities that provides, but also to be closer to the coast. We're within 20 minutes away of probably 5 of the best beaches in the UK. And where I lived previously, I was landlocked by 2 hours. Beaches were a fantasy, but it means so much in terms of, and it opens up the opportunities for all of those different kinds of activities. My children now are we spend a lot of time in nature, outdoors, walking on the coast. They paddleboard, they do all of these things. When we lived in Bedford, that probably wouldn't have happened. So, the importance of space, the affordances that provides, the opportunities, as you say. But I wanted to kind of segue into here, and then Kat, I think you want to come here as well. The importance of that whole package deal for our well-being. Yeah. And how that, and again, this is something the serious leisure perspective has had some sway over, the whole kind of subjective well-being, but actually more broadly in terms of societal well-being. So I wonder, Kat, did you want to come in here at this point to talk, from a sense for music and that perspective of well-being, and then we can maybe explore the idea of well-being more broadly in the context of the serious leisure perspective.
Yes. Well, firstly, even, thinking outside of like landscape geography, the importance of space, I was on mute, like preach, because, that we kind of, having the Centre for Music as a physical space is absolutely critical. Because it's free, anyone can go in there, and this accessibility, this fact that you don't have to have money for deep sea fishing to do that, you don't have to have bought yourself a tuba, because we've got a few lying around. The dismantling of those barriers is absolutely essential, and from my point of view, there's a sort of social justice angle there, and then I sort of we justify a project like that on the shoulders of what the serious leisure perspective can provide in terms of what are the benefits. So the kind of well-being literature is kind of jumped on the shoulders, in my opinion, of a lot of the SLP observations without realizing, these worlds are starting to intersect more effectively now. But we look at social prescribing, which is kind of saying, oh, take a leisure activity and that's going to be good for your mental health and whatever. But of course, this is what the serious leisure perspective has been talking about for quite a long time, and helps to then justify, a project like the Centre for Music. And sure enough, that is at the heart of what we are doing as a project, is about student wellbeing and maintaining mental health, because as we know, that's what those things can do. And the last thing I was going to say, which struck me, Sam, as you were speaking, is thinking about, people uprooting their lives, and you've moved to the coast and people go to these different places. And Petia put in the chat, which people who are listening, you won't have seen, but I'll just share this with you. She mentioned when she was looking for a house, it had to be within a 30-minute walk to Improv Theatre. And indeed, where I am, we had to have a place that was big enough to fit a piano. That's just make or break. Even if everyone's in the shed, there's got to be a room for the piano, right? So I think there's a way in which actually for me, the real benefit of serious leisure perspective and the use of the word serious is that what we're doing is kind of identifying that somewhere really our leisure, it's somehow a more core part of who we are. And that is why it's so linked to our well-being. Because having those things maintained and expressed, that's what gives us this equilibrium and meaning and satisfaction, all the other things we've been talking about today, but so often get deprioritized, because the word leisure is complicated, isn't it? It's difficult. And so we need that serious adjective, which I know has some very specific meanings, Bob, in the theory that you've developed in terms of how people behave. But for me, at a sort of step away level, it helps to make sure that people feel justified, in making time for their leisure and understanding that it's an expression of authentic self. And of course, in the case of my work, funding projects that make it possible.
We didn't say much about optimal leisure lifestyle, but that fits this discussion in a sense that people can explore as to what kind of leisure or kinds of leisure go best with their lifestyle. And that usually means taking account of work and non-work obligations, and then having some casual leisure to go when you can't do the serious stuff, or you've done so much serious, there's no more energy left to do that kind of leisure. So now's the time to watch TV or go to the coffee shop and talk about leisure, but you're not, and gossip about leisure, but you're not, in fact, doing it, so it's not tiring, but it's still interesting. Well-being would be very much linked to finding a proper optimal leisure lifestyle, which would include some serious, of course, some casual or projects. We haven't said much about project-based leisure, but that's going to be more important. We're going to wish we had more data on that, because we've got to find the project-based leisure enthusiasts. Crossword puzzles, for example. Crossword puzzles and jigsaw puzzles. Anyway, well-being is definitely tied up with this.
Yeah, I there's a sense of balance, Bob, in what you've described and listed. Yeah. That sense of balance, and that I think is such an intersection then with what the well-being discussion is trying to achieve. And when we think about the work-life stuff, at the centre of that is balance, isn't it? And that is the challenge.
Some people achieve what I would call optimal leisure lifestyle by staying with casual leisure, but doing all kinds of different stuff. So they watch TV for a bit, then they're off to the coffee shop for another bit. Then they sit on the veranda and watch the traffic go by, take a nap, and in the course of it all, they fill up a day. And it's varied, but interesting to them. Now, you don't develop yourself much, but you don't get bored either. But the level of excitement is pretty moderate. So, and how much coffee can you drink and that sort of thing? Or how much gossip can you take? So it's but there are people who do that. Sam.
Yeah, and I think it's worth kind of drawing out here as well that so many of the serious leisure pursuits start out as a casual level.
Mm-hmm.
It's a casual, I might pick up a book and read about something. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to explore that, and 4 or 5 years down the line, all of a sudden, I'm immersed in a social world I previously knew nothing about. And I think that's something else that we, I think sometimes don't. I'm thinking, this is fitting into this broader kind of well-being kind of agenda here. So we think, and I think it's got a lot to do with the culture that we're in today, where we feel like, if we're going to invest our time and effort into something, it needs to be something that's, worthwhile and, needs to lead to something, and we're missing out on so many of those opportunities because we're not willing to take a swing at something new or, so for example, we had a break just before Christmas, and for the first time in probably 25 years, I picked up a bow and arrow, and realized now there's a whole backstory here in terms of my grandparents used to own a pub. They used to do archery competitions. It was a very small village, and as a child, I'd spend time doing that. I wasn't very good because I was very small, and it was long bows, and as the name suggests, they were longer than I was.
Yeah.
But actually, it was, there was a remembering of an enjoyment that I'd once had, and actually, so rediscovering leisure later on in life is something else that, and I think we get closed off from that, from the discovering, being curious about new, or opening up to and remembering and rediscovering old leisure pursuits. I think society has something to say about that, and then you start to focus down on the kind of subculture of academia, and just how negative that can be in terms of its draw on our resources. I think there's a lot in there, isn't there? Petya, do you want to come in there?
Thanks, Sam. There's an open-mindedness to trying new things and failing at them and not being any good. And I'm just reflecting on my own experiences over the last 3 years. Petya 10 years ago would have not had the courage to try something out, or to be going to singing lesson when she's been told that, for a very long time she has no voice for singing, and being quite scared and just learning as almost like as a little child to kind of discover your voice and try to use it as an instrument. And I think the perfectionism, and I talk about myself, but that's also so inherent in academia, that we have to be the best at, the most proficient. And we often get into academia because maybe we were good students, and and suddenly to find yourself being new at something and not so good at something, and maybe it doesn't come naturally to you. Maybe academic subjects did, and suddenly this is a whole mindset that's needed, and some of the creating of this mindset is dismantling kind of societal and professional assumptions that are needed before you enter that space. So in my case, when we talked about this in episode 2, when I was talking about improv, in my case, it was a health event that kind of triggered this, let's find a different life to live. But in many, and I'm thinking now COVID might provide this framework for a lot of people thinking about work and life balance and burnout, and where they find joy and playfulness in almost in a more strategic way, because we all have to kind of rethink and rediscover that. Yes, I wanted to come in here to just say all of what you said, Sam, is really important. But we need to discover the mindset to be free to try out and to be free to fail and to be free to rediscover old passions or to find new ones.
Reminds me that I didn't mention that Wikipedia has a list of hobbies titled as such. If you write out a list of hobbies, you'll get it. And it goes on for pages. Now, a lot of them are not hobbies by, SLP standards, but they are serious leisure, basically amateur or hobbyist, and some volunteering are in this list. But it's a good place to go to sort of see what it is you might like to do, because people need some sense of choice. So go find an activity now that you're stuck at home alone because of COVID. Well, that's all well and good, but I can't think of any. Well, go to Wikipedia, you'll get quite a list. And then you can put yourself in that place and say, well, that sounds good, forget that. If you reject the whole list, then you should consult your psychiatrist, I guess. But whatever. It's a big list.
That really made me laugh when you said that, Bob. Yeah, because I think Sam, when you were talking about we've lost that thing about trying stuff out, and I think what is so interesting about leisure, I'm really going to have a look, Bob, at your book that defines what leisure is, because that's really got my brain ticking when we think about what leisure is, because it can be an organic process. Can't it? So obviously that you have to have that intention to, you had to go to your first improv session, Petya. And Sam, you had to bother to go and get access to a bow to revisit this or whatever. But you didn't have to have like a 5-year plan on what am I doing with this whole archery dabble, right? Or I've started doing outdoor swimming, controversially in a wetsuit. There are many people doing that in swimsuits. Fair play to them. I'm there with my wetsuit and my gloves on, I don't have a 5-year plan. I've got in the water about 4 times, and I think that's pretty good going. And so it's very liberating to think, I'm just going to stick my toe in the water, and say, Bob, I love this idea of like looking at the hobbies on Wikipedia, or as we'd say on the podcast, listen to our other episodes for inspiration, of course, and think, well, I'd just take a punt at something. What's the worst that could happen? It's such a contrast to this kind of intention-based 5-year plan. What's your achievement? What's your standard? Which definitely dominates academia, but quite honestly, I think is a broad social culture that we all have to live in. And leisure can give us a break from that, can't it? Thank goodness.
Interest in leisure is far more complex than we give credit for. That's in part because there's no decent definition. I would say saving my own, but we'll see about that. Well, 2 things about it. One, I have a one-sentence definition, which I call a dictionary style definition, but that's set out in that book over several chapters. And that comes from the observation that a complex idea requires a lot of space. And that's where dictionaries really aren't much help. If you really want to get a substantial grip on the phenomenon. When I was doing the book on play and leisure, I went to the OED just to check how much space the 2 were getting. Play got 2.5 pages, I think it was, of OED spacing. That's a lot for the word play as a verb and noun and so on. Leisure got 1.5 columns or something. But even that's a lot. But it helped explain why play has become extremely difficult to define, because we use it in so many different ways in common sense that it just upends any attempt to make a decent definition. There have been some, but they're not through that one yet. So,
yeah, Bob, it is interesting, isn't it? Just the sheer breadth of when you really get into it, the breadth of the concept of leisure, and how that kind of intermingles with so much of life. Probably the majority of it,
yeah.
and yet ironically, it's the bit we spend least time thinking about. And I can't help but think and I don't want to get anybody started here, but I can't help but think it's got a lot to do with how we're educated. Obviously, broader societal structures and processes, and that plays into it as well. But we don't educate for leisure; we educate for work. And then we wonder why it's such a struggle to find fulfilling leisure.
Yeah,
and I think that's a really, really powerful kind of realization. And why the places like the Centre for Music and similar kind of institutions and organizations are so important, because it offers an alternative. It offers something that rubs against the trend of, well, it has to be work related to matter. Well, no, it doesn't. And just as a kind of a closing kind of observation, I guess, from me here, is how much of what we've been discussing here today has shown me that leisure is actually the lens for so much of that. You look through the leisure lens, and you see different things. And so this whole podcast is about shining the leisure lens on the work-life well-being kind of relationship, and trying to understand that. And I think that's something that the podcast and that the conversation we've had today has really shown me, is just how important that lens is. And it's quite an insightful one. Bob, you've been using that lens now for well over 40 years and still turning up new things. That suggests to me that we should probably continue looking.
Yes.
But Betty, did you want to bring us to a close?
I just want to give Bob an opportunity, because he wants to respond to your comment, and I think it's important to do that. So, Bob.
Well, leisure is misunderstood, and it doesn't take long to find that out when you're out and about and talking to people about it. The biggest bête noire for understanding leisure is its common sense understanding. As I say, I've got the book Leisure Legacy that wanders into that minefield, and so far hasn't been blown up, but it is it's so broad. Often we'll get the comment from our colleagues, well, you got leisure down for the Western world, but what about the other parts of the world? I think that's something can handle itself with the definition that's used. And whether we're talking Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Mali, you name it. People have free time in which they're not obligated to do anything, but as it were, play or do leisure. And then the activities will be different, but they'll still be free time activities. So otherwise time has to be spent, getting something to eat, fighting off enemies, dealing with disease, etc., etc. So, but it's hard to drive that simple point across. Our colleagues are not used to a broad scale approach to free time activities. They've got caught up in, constraints and facilitators, recreational specialization, on and on. Flow is broader, but flow isn't everything either. So, well, not everything's in flow, let's put it that way. Poor old Cheek sent me eyes. He's got a list of 8 points. They all have to be addressed. And for example, if the activity like a bungee jump requires no skill, it still gets called flow. But the definition of flow wouldn't include that. just somebody who likes bungee jumping. So anyway.
Thanks, Bob. For our regular listeners, this is not me stopping the conversation on flow, which Sam always accuses me of doing. This is us running out of time, I'm afraid. And as you know, we can continue this conversation forever. But it is hitting 7:30 in the evening on a Friday for those of us here in the UK, and there's family duties at play. And I know Bob has been really gracious with us, spending a lot of time with us, but I'm mindful also of the toll this is taking on his voice. So I would just like to close it here. We are all in a situation where we are balancing fighting a disease. We're now a COVID universe and leisure. And we all believe that this is an important conversation to be had. And we are all so grateful to the insight that Bob has brought to this conversation. So first of all, Bob, thank you so much for your time and for your contribution today. It has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be here or there or wherever I am. And I was going to say, we'll do it again sometime. So I'm sure there'll be things to say.
We might well take you up on that offer. And yes, there would always be a lot of things to
now
say
that we
about
got
this
Zoom figured out, probably moving the goalposts. We get it figured out and then it changes.
If only we can all fly out to Canada and have this conversation there in person. Yes, yeah. Sam is looking distraught at this moment.
Would be nice, yeah. Or I could get to Britain, but right now I can't fly, so we'll have to settle for Zoom.
Yes, so. we will unfortunately have to do so. Yeah. Talking about online, if our listeners are interested to hear some of our previous episodes, you can find these on southcloud.com under the Serious Leisure podcast. We're featured there under the University of the West of England umbrella. So this is it for today. I already thanked Bob. Thank you, Sam, for your commentary.
Thanks very much, Betty. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, for your insights and questions and bringing in the practice around your work with the Centre for Music.
Bravo.
Thank you. This is doing fascinating. Thank you so much.
And I would also like to thank our wider podcast team, Julia Denham and Helge Ganestadir. Helge has been patiently recording and noting all the bloopers, and those have been mostly mine. Goodbye, everyone. Until next time, when we continue to talk about leisure, work, and well-being, and what we can do to engage with leisure seriously. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.